What compels a man sentenced to death to gamble his life for a few hours of freedom? How did Leon Gregg, a name forever tied to America's legal reckoning with capital punishment, engineer a jaw-dropping escape from one of Georgia's most secure prisons, only to die violently hours later? Was his fate sealed by irony? Or did his own choices trap him in a cycle of self-destruction? And why does his story linger like a ghost in the corridors of justice? On July 28, 1980, Georgia State Prison, a fortress designed to hold the nation's most dangerous criminals, suffered an unprecedented breach. Leon Gregg, the first death row inmate in U.S. history to have his death sentence upheld after the Supreme Court reinstated capital punishment, vanished into the humid summer night. His escape was audacious, a meticulously planned breakout involving hacksaw blades, a claustrophobic crawl through a drainage pipe, and 30 hours of nerve-wracking suspense. Yet within hours of tasting freedom, Gregg lay dead in a North Carolina forest, shot by his own accomplice. His story is a collision of legal history, human desperation, and the haunting question, can anyone truly escape their fate? Troy Gregg was no stranger to trouble. Born in 1948 in rural North Carolina, his childhood was marred by poverty and neglect. By his teens, he had become a drifter, hopping freight trains and surviving on petty theft. By 1973, the 25-year-old was a hardened wanderer, hitchhiking across the South with a .25 caliber pistol in his pocket, a tool he claimed was for protection. But on November 21, 1973, Gregg's life took a darker turn. Picture a long, desolate highway in Florida. Two young hitchhikers, Gregg and his friend Floyd Allen, with nothing but a few dollars in their pockets, hoping for a ride to a better tomorrow. Their lives took an unforeseen detour when they were picked up near Atlanta by two unsuspecting factory workers, Fred Edward Simmons and Bob Durwood Moore. At first glance, the encounter might have seemed like a stroke of luck for the stranded pair, but as the journey progressed, dark intentions surfaced. At some point, the vehicle broke down. Instead of calling for help, Simmons casually pulled out cash and purchased another car on the spot. With their journey continuing, the men eventually picked up another hitchhiker, Dennis Weaver, who rode with them for a while before being dropped off in Atlanta later that evening. It remains unclear exactly what transpired during the remainder of the ride, but Gregg would later claim that tensions escalated after Weaver left. According to Gregg's version of events, Simmons became violent, striking him and knocking him into a drainage ditch. Gregg argued in court, "Fred hit me on the left jaw and knocked me in the drainage ditch. He hit me the second time and knocked me back in. I don't know what he had in his hand. It could have been a knife or a pipe. I don't know what it was. But when he came at me the second time, I shot him." But that story starkly contrasted with Allen's version of events. Allen recalled Gregg turning to him and coldly stating, "Get out, we're going to rob them." Moments later, as the car came to a halt at a rest stop near Gwinnett County, Georgia, Gregg produced his .25 caliber automatic pistol and fired 3 shots. Simmons and Moore collapsed into a drainage ditch. In a brutal display of calculated violence, Gregg walked up to them and fired one more shot into each of their heads, ensuring they wouldn't survive. He then rifled through their pockets, taking their money and valuables, up to $140, before stealing Simmons' newly purchased car and fleeing with Allen. The following day, the bodies of Simmons and Moore were discovered in a lake, and the murders made headlines. When Dennis Weaver saw the story in the newspaper, he immediately recognized the names and descriptions and went to the police. Providing key details, including a description of the stolen car, Weaver set in motion the swift downfall of Gregg and Allen. The fugitives were captured the next day in Asheville, North Carolina. When police arrested them, Gregg still had the handgun used in the murders. Both men were taken into custody and charged with murder and armed robbery. To make matters worse for Gregg, investigators later uncovered a letter he had written to Allen, instructing him on what to say during the trial. But the evidence was already overwhelming. The weapon, the stolen car, and Allen's testimony painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. In the aftermath of the murders, Leon Gregg's case became more than just a criminal trial. It turned into a legal showdown that would change the future of the death penalty in America. At the heart of the battle was a case known as Gregg versus Georgia. This wasn't just about whether Gregg was guilty. It was a fight over whether the death penalty itself was fair or even constitutional. Gregg had been convicted of murder and armed robbery and sentenced to death. But his case came at a pivotal moment. Just a few years earlier, in 1972, the Supreme Court had ruled in Furman versus Georgia that the death penalty, as it was being applied, was unconstitutional. The court felt that the death penalty was applied randomly and often in a biased way, depending on things like race or where the crime happened. Because of this ruling, executions across the country were put on hold. States like Georgia had to go back and rewrite their laws to make the death penalty process more fair and consistent. Georgia's new law introduced a two-part trial system, one phase to decide guilt and another to determine the sentence. During the sentencing phase, the jury would weigh aggravating factors, things that made the crime worse, against mitigating factors, reasons the defendant might deserve mercy. Gregg's case became the test of whether this new system passed constitutional muster. The Supreme Court's decision in Gregg versus Georgia came down on July 2, 1976. In a close 7-2 vote, the court ruled that Georgia's new death penalty law was constitutional. The justices said that if applied carefully, the death penalty didn't violate the 8th Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Justice Porter Stewart, writing for the majority, argued that the new system was strict enough to prevent unfair or random sentencing. But not everyone agreed. Justices William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall strongly dissented, arguing that the death penalty was inherently cruel and stripped people of their basic human dignity. The trial itself was dramatic, with two very different stories being told. Gregg's defense team argued that he acted out of fear and desperation, while the prosecution laid out a clear and chilling timeline of events. Gregg's own words during the trial added to the tension. At one point, he said, "By God, I wanted them dead." Was this a moment of raw honesty, a boast, or a cry of despair? It was hard to tell, but it highlighted the complexity of his character and the case. In the end, the Supreme Court's decision sealed Gregg's fate. The death penalty was back on the table, and Gregg's sentence was upheld. But his case left a lasting mark. It didn't just decide his future. It sparked a national debate about justice, fairness, and whether the death penalty could ever truly be applied in a way that balanced punishment with humanity. For many, Gregg vs. Georgia wasn't just a legal milestone. It was a moment that forced America to confront hard questions about life, death, and the meaning of justice. Yet, even as the legal battle over his fate played out in the courts, Gregg's story took another dramatic turn, one that would see him defy the very system that had condemned him. Georgia's state prison wasn't just any prison. Known as the Plantation, its towering walls held over 1,000 inmates, including 90 men on death row. Guards kept a close watch, but Troy Leon Gregg noticed something others didn't: a small metal grate in the cell block floor that led to a drainage pipe. It was narrow, but just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. For Gregg, it was a glimmer of hope. Gregg wasn't alone in his plan. He teamed up with 3 other death row inmates: Ricky Wayne Morrow, David Jarrell, and Johnny Lee Johnson. Over weeks, they secretly smuggled hacksaw blades into their cells. Slowly and carefully, they cut through the bars of their cells and the metal grate. It was a risky, painstaking process, but freedom was worth the gamble. On the night of July 28, 1980, the plan went into action. The 4 men slipped through the grate and into the drainage pipe. For 30 grueling hours, they crawled through the filthy, stinking water, inching their way toward freedom. Finally, they emerged into a moonlit field, gasping for air and tasting the sweet relief of escape. But their freedom was short-lived. The same night they broke out, Gregg's life came to a violent end. He was beaten to death, his daring escape ending in tragedy. The other 3 inmates were eventually recaptured, their dreams of freedom shattered. The escape itself was as bold as it was clever. The men had altered their prison uniforms to look like guards' outfits, so convincing that they passed multiple security checks without raising suspicion. Inside the prison's exercise room, they sawed through cell bars in a window, then scaled a ledge to reach a fire escape. Outside, a getaway car awaited, arranged by one of the inmates' family members. For a brief moment, it seemed like the impossible had happened. 4 death row inmates had outsmarted the system. But in the end, the story of Troy Leon Gregg's escape was a stark reminder that even the most daring plans can unravel, leaving behind a trail of broken hopes and harsh consequences. The escape was a stunning feat of determination, but the aftermath of Gregg's breakout would become a tangled web of mystery, violence, and unanswered questions. Georgia State Prison was supposed to be escape-proof, especially for death row inmates. But on July 28, 1980, Troy Leon Gregg and 3 other condemned men proved otherwise. Their daring breakout made history as the first escape from death row in Georgia. Yet, for Gregg, freedom was fleeting, and his story ended in mystery and violence. Hours after the escape, guards discovered the 4 men were missing. The alarm was raised not by the prison staff, but by Gregg himself. In a bizarre twist, he called the Albany Herald from outside to complain about the inhumane conditions in the prison. The reporter he spoke to immediately alerted prison officials, sparking a massive manhunt. What happened next is shrouded in conflicting accounts, each more dramatic than the last. Some say Gregg's escape ended in a biker bar in North Carolina, where he had been drinking heavily. According to this version, Gregg harassed a bartender and became violent when she rejected him. A local biker stepped in, defending the woman, and a brutal fight broke out. Gregg was beaten to death, and his body was dumped in a lake behind the bar. Others claim Gregg was killed by one of his fellow escapees, and a man named James Horn, a member of the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. This theory suggests Gregg's body was found in the Catawba River, covered in bruises and signs of a violent struggle. Horn and another man, William Flamont, were initially charged with Gregg's murder, but the charges were later dropped due to a lack of evidence. There's even a third version of events. Gregg allegedly wrote letters to his wife detailing the escape plan. When he shared the details with his fellow inmates, they turned on him, enraged. In this account, they beat him to death and dumped his body in a lake. No matter which story is true, they all end the same way, with Gregg's lifeless body discovered in the water, bearing the marks of a brutal fight. The official cause of death was suffocation caused by swelling, but the identity of his killer, or killers, remains a mystery more than 40 years later. As for the other escapees, their fates were sealed. Timothy McCordale was executed in 1987 for the 1974 murder of Donna Dixon. David Jarrell and Johnny Lee Johnson, the other 2 men who escaped with Gregg, were recaptured and are now serving life sentences for their own crimes. Jarrell was convicted of murdering Mala Still in 1973, while Johnson killed Suzanne Edenfield in 1974. The escape sent shockwaves through Georgia's prison system. Officials quickly moved to transfer death row inmates from the aging Reidsville facility to the more secure Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison in Jackson. The breakout also exposed glaring vulnerabilities in the prison security, prompting reforms to prevent such a daring escape from happening again. Troy Leon Gregg's story is one of audacity, desperation, and tragedy. He escaped death row, but he couldn't escape death itself. His life ended as violently as it had been lived, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a legacy that forever changed Georgia's prison system. Troy Leon Gregg's story is both shocking and full of contradictions. He reshaped American law, yet died a fugitive. He sought freedom, but found only a bullet. His escape laid bare the fragility of justice and the futility of outrunning fate. Today, Gregg vs. Georgia still underpins capital punishment, a reminder that one man's crimes can alter history. Yet, in the end, Troy Gregg's greatest triumph was also his undoing, a death sentence he defied only to fulfill in the shadows of a North Carolina forest. Did he ever grasp the irony? Or was his final breath spent cursing the freedom that killed him? If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to Breakout Bank for more videos.